Well, hello, church, and welcome to the Rewind for the week of February the 5th. We are on location this week, standing directly behind our facility here at Creekside. I figured no better place to talk about Joshua chapter 3 and Joshua chapter 4 than right here on the banks of this little creek river. 2 weeks ago, Joshua and Israel are camped along the banks of the Jordan River, looking across it at the Promised Land. There was only one problem. They had no possible way of ever crossing that river. Now, here's the difference between the Jordan River and this little creek. This creek, at its greatest depth, is probably 5 or 6 feet deep. At its greatest width, 10 feet across. It'll get you wet, it'll get you muddy, it will slow you down, but it will not stop you. The Jordan River is a whole nother story. 13 miles long, 20 yards wide, 17 feet deep. They had no possible way of ever crossing that body of water. The good news for them was that they served a God who is in the business of transforming obstacles into miracles. In fact, one generation before, Moses and Israel are standing in a very similar situation with an army behind them and a Red Sea in front of them, needing God to work a miracle. And Joshua chapter 3 is faith deja vu all over again, because God does the exact same thing. The waters part, Israel walks through, and they get one step closer to the Promised Land. That set the stage for everything that we talked about this past Sunday. We're going to rewind that message right now and hopefully encourage you through the rest of the week. This past Sunday, we find Joshua and Israel on the banks of the Jordan River. They had passed through the water. They are one step closer to the Promised Land. But before they go any further, God tells them to do something very interesting, to stop, to slow down, to pause, to reflect, so that they can get their mind, their heart, and their spirit right before they move into the Promised Land. Because if those things aren't right, you will find yourself living in the Promised Land, but not experiencing the promised life. It happens. A couple of weeks ago, we saw the story of Rahab. Here is a woman who was living in the Promised Land, but she wasn't experiencing the promised life. In order to do that, we have to make sure that our mind, our heart, and our spirit is right to experience the fullness of everything that God has. We broke that down into 3 parts, and here was the first merge. That's right, deliberately remember, because not forgetting is not enough. Joshua, I want you to go back into the river. I want you to pull out some stones. I want you to build a monument right here on the banks of the Jordan, so that when your children ask, and your children's children ask you what that monument is all about, you will be able to remind them that that is a moment where God turned an obstacle into a miracle. It's a moment of faith. It's a moment of promise. It's a moment of power. It's a moment of grace. It's a moment of mercy. It's a moment that declares God did it here, and He will do it in your life and in mine as well. One of the big pushes in this series has been centered around this idea of how the story always moves forward. We have a tendency of dragging the past and the baggage of the past with us into the present, and eventually that will slow us down and drown us out into the future. We need to let go of all that. We need to sink it in the bottom of the river. But we do need to bring forward with us the fragments of the past that are declarations of God's miracle-working power, that are witnesses and testimonies to His grace, to His mercy, to His promise, and to His faithfulness. Those are the things that will ignite our faith and inspire us to move forward with courageous faith and courage and boldness, and assume a promised land and experience a promised life that comes from a promise-filled God. Deliberately remember, because just saying we're not going to forget is not enough. We need to be intentional on reminding ourselves, of sharing our stories, our witnesses, our testimonies. This is our God. He did it here. He did it here. He did it here. Obstacle became a miracle. The obstacle became a miracle. And whatever we're facing now, or whatever we'll face in the future, God will do it again. Deliberately remember, because not forgetting is not enough. You never outgrow the basics. For 40 years, Israel journeyed through the desert, and during that time, they abandoned a practice that was part of God's original covenant and promise with Abraham. It was the practice of circumcision. And here on the banks of the Jordan, God looks at Joshua and says, I want you to reestablish that practice. It's the symbol of a life that is fully committed and fully devoted to God. Now in the New Testament, we discover that it's the circumcision of the heart that declares life fully committed and fully devoted to God. No matter where our faith takes us or where this adventure with God leads us, we will never outgrow that basic principle. That this faith that we are living, this Christ following that we are part of, it is rooted in Jesus Christ and in Jesus alone. And it is driven by love. The way in which you miss out on experiencing the promised life in the promised land is by being sidetracked from that. And life has a way of trying to sidetrack off of it or convince us that that is too simple, that it must be more complex than that. We will never outgrow the basic principle that our faith is rooted in Jesus Christ and it is driven by love. As long as we have that right, as long as we're standing on that foundation, we will move forward into the promise that God has carved out for us, and we will experience the promised life that God is blessing us with. That's right, don't miss out on the blessing of this moment. Joshua, take off your sandals because the place where you were standing is holy ground. Now here's the cool thing about that. Jericho wasn't even in sight. A battle hadn't been fought. A victory had not been won. And yet there is this declaration of holiness, that this is a holy moment, that this is holy ground. And if we dial into this understanding, this is one of those things that will transform our lives. No matter where we go, no matter where we are, school, work, home, church, neighborhoods, events, wherever it is that we are, it is a holy moment. Because that moment, just like Joshua's moment, is filled with the holy promise and power of God. And if we will dial into that, it will transform everything in our lives. We have a tendency to let the chaos or the craziness of the moment overtake us, or let the stress or the frustration of the moment overtake us. But if we will just pause and reflect, remember, deliberately remember. Not forgetting is not enough. If we deliberately remember, then we will recognize in that moment when we think that we can't or that we think it won't, we will recognize that the holiness of God is here, that the power and the promise of God is here, and we will experience the blessing of this moment. Don't miss out on the blessing of this moment. Well, there you go, church. That is the rewind for the week of February the 5th. I hope you have an incredible day. I hope you have an incredible week. God has great things in store for you. Be strong, be encouraged, be courageous, and know that everywhere you go, the holiness, the power, and the promise of God is right there with you. See you soon, church.